Hi, welcome to Neuroverse
A podcast hosted by Carolina.
and Clara, where we discuss all matters from neuroscience to philosophy and beyond.
Today's episode is on sleep deprivation.
What about it?
So, we'll be looking at whether sleep is required for survival and I guess what is the consequence of sleep deprivation. We all know that sleeping is bad for you, or so no
What?
not sleeping in sufficient hours is bad for you,
Yes.
or so we're told. But how is it actually bad for you? No one's actually shown that lack of sleep can causally lead to death or anything like that. And so
Really?
I think so, which is why we're still trying to figure out why, like, it does lead to death, but we don't know exactly what causes it.
I think it's been shown in animals that have been tested experimentally that if you sleep deprive them, they eventually die. But yeah, it's not understood why.
Yeah, they do eventually die.
Yeah,
but
and,
why?
And also, I doubt any human records have shown like cause of death, sleep deprivation.
Yeah, as I know that I listened to this podcast by Let's Learn Everything, I think, and they did an episode on sleep deprivation as well. And the closest that they went with human trials and sleep deprivation, it would lead to insanity.
Yeah.
And I think also maybe a few deaths, but essentially overall, physiologically, we don't know how the dots are connected. We don't know what is causative and what is a consequence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I find it really interesting thinking about what the actual function of sleep is. I mentioned this in a previous episode on sleep and memory. But the fact that sleep puts us in a very vulnerable state because, you know, we're inactive and we're not responsive to the stimuli in the world around us. But yet every animal has been shown to sleep, and humans spend around 2/3 of their lives sleeping. So it must have like a very important function. Yeah.
And exploring the cause of sleep deprivation, Dragana Regulja's lab in Harvard University did some really interesting research with flies and mice. And
oh yeah, because fruit flies are a commonly used animal to study neuroscience.
Yeah.
And for many other reasons I'm not going to get into. But like they're especially used to study sleep because the clock genes that control circadian rhythms were actually discovered in fruit flies.
Oh,
yeah.
I didn't know that.
But yeah, Dragana
Regulja.
Dragana Regulja.
I think.
Yeah.
I hope that I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Yeah.
So essentially they conducted the same experiments, the experiment on flies and then later on mice, but the results were the same. They showed that after a significant amount of sleep deprivation, reactive oxygen species started to build up in the gut. And
it's so interesting because you wouldn't think that the effect would be in the gut.
Yes.
I think a lot of us as humans think of sleep as a cognitive thing that happens in the brain.
Exactly. It's so interesting, and they did try. I noticed that in the paper they tried to explain it in a way where they looked at all of the organs. They tried to look at all of like the physiological processes happening, and the common factor and the thing that was most significantly affected was the gut with this buildup of reactive oxygen species. Reactive oxygen species are it's an oxygen that has an unpaired electron, and unpaired electrons are incredibly reactive, and these are often found in several diseases, and it's usually present in cancer. It's often present in chromatid instability. So for example, Fragile X syndrome, as well as Huntington's disease, all of these different it's not a good thing. Reactive oxygen species.
Getting the point across.
Yes, exactly.
It's also associated with every single neurodegenerative disorder.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the fact that there is a massive buildup of reactive oxygen species in the gut led them to then try and answer the question, well, is this a product of the sleep deprivation, or is this a consequence? No, sorry, a causing
A cause.
a cause of death due to the sleep deprivation, right?
So is the buildup of reactive oxygen species in the gut responsible for the death that is caused by sleep deprivation?
Yeah.
Is it the thing that links the two?
Yes.
Yeah.
They were trying to determine whether it's a cause or a consequence.
Yes.
Simply put. Yeah, sleep loss alters and dysregulates a lot of redox states and lots of sleep regulating neurons in the brain. So, in order to keep the flies or the mice sleep deprived, they used thermoregulation and thermogenetic stimulation of different neurons, which get activated or deactivated due to temperature.
Ooh.
Yeah.
That's so interesting because I was just listening to a podcast about sleep with Matthew Walker, who wrote the book Why We Sleep, I think it's called.
Yeah.
Which I have to confess I haven't read, so I feel like I'm not qualified to talk about sleep. But but anyways, I listened to a podcast.
Yes.
And he was saying how temperature regulates sleep more than anything else does. So
Including light.
Exactly, specifically light. So the reason that humans tend to wake up at dawn is because it's at the point just when the temperature begins to rise, which is actually before the sunrise. And how he said we need to warm up in order to cool down, in order to fall asleep, and then to stay asleep we need to stay cool, and to wake up we need to warm up.
Yes, it makes sense and it's so interesting, but it feels at the same time so counterintuitive. I feel like we have this idea about light and darkness, and so going back to these genes, they tested this cation channel called TRPA1, which is activated by heat. So at 21 degrees Celsius, this cation channel is closed, but once the temperature rises above this point, it opens. And at 29 degrees, they are open, and it causes the neurons to be stimulated. And this was what was used to keep the mice and the flies awake for several days.
So by keeping them warm.
Wow. Yeah.
I thought that they usually do sleep deprivation experiments by like constantly aggravating the animals.
Yeah,
so
I don't
like
know.
with flies, they like constantly move the test tubes that they're kept in so that they, every time they're about to fall asleep, they're being hit.
Yeah.
Which is so horrible.
It is really horrible.
It's really not a nice thing to study, but so I have read the paper, but I didn't read it in depth, and I was thinking, could a potential mechanism as to why sleep altered reactive oxygen species in the gut be because one major function of sleep is to activate the parasympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is the nervous system that is responsible for involuntary action or involuntary mechanisms, and the parasympathetic system is the one that is responsible for rest and digest, it's known as. And so whereas a sympathetic is more like arousal and stimulation. So during sleep, your parasympathetic system is activated, and this has a major role in digestion by stimulating the production of enzymes needed for digestion. So perhaps if you don't get sleep, you're not having enough of this parasympathetic activation of digestion, and by altering the enzyme composition in the gut, maybe this is linked to the buildup of reactive oxygen species.
That it's so interesting you say that, because I think they did look at studies carried out with so sleep deprived animals. We usually associate them with having a higher metabolic activity due to the sleep deprivation, and one of the major sources of reactive oxygen species is in ATP synthase, which is involved in the citric acid cycle, and it releases energy, and it's where oxygen is used. They noticed that overeating was not a cause of reactive oxygen species consumption, because they compared these two different studies to rule eating as a cause of reactive oxygen species accumulation and therefore premature death, which I think kind of relates to what you were saying about whether or not.
Wait, so overeating is linked to the accumulation of reactive...
No, it's not, compared to what we assumed. So parasympathetic, being involved with digestion, is not necessarily the cause or plays a major role in reactive oxygen species accumulation, which then again indicates that it's a matter of the lack of sleep and not a matter of the metabolism. Does that make sense?
Yes, but I was saying that sleep activates the parasympathetic system.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know. That logic does make sense. I don't know what the literature is about this. So I guess it's interesting how there are these two different competing views, and in a way it makes sense because sleep has not been solved. Yeah. And there's so many different contributing factors to how good sleep is and how bad lack of sleep can be, and what is the cause of death from lack of sleep.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how it's always so much more complicated than we think it is.
So I find it interesting, the idea that sleep may be a function of the whole body in terms of its role in metabolism of the cells throughout the body, not just the brain, like here with the gut. But this reminded me of something that I read, which is that a lot of people have over time been coming up with studies to try to detect sleep in different animals to see, do they really sleep? And it has been detected in animals that don't necessarily have a brain.
Oh, nice.
Such as hydra, which are a type of sponge, and they have a nervous system, but it's very basic and primitive, and they don't have a brain. And study was able to detect sleep in them, and they studied differences in sleep regulation in these animals versus other animals. And they found that in hydra, sleep is very homeostatic, so it's linked to how much mechanical activity they displayed during the waking state. So if they move more, then they sleep more, which makes sense. Sleep was also found to be necessary for the proliferation of cells, so like for growth, which also makes logical sense. And they also found that dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that is necessary for arousal in like humans and most mammals and even the flies, they found that dopamine in hydra was actually had the opposite function. So an increase in dopamine was associated with inducing sleep.
Oh, interesting.
And so they hypothesized that there was a switch in these sleep promoting pathways at some point in evolutionary development of these species, and that sleep's original role in these more archaic creatures was not cognitive, like not to do with the brain, but was rather to provide a scenario in which metabolic functions can occur.
Wow, yeah, that's so cool. I think, I can't remember another example, but I do think that there's a few cases where the regulatory pathway works in a specific way with like mammals, and then you look at a different species and like the same enzymes can have like the opposite effect. Yeah, it's super interesting.
But sorry, that was a bit of a tangent from the paper, the reactive oxygen species.
Yes.
Work.
No, it was so interesting. I just wanted to say a couple more things about the reactive oxygen species.
Yeah, definitely.
And so they then went on to figure out whether the lack of sleep itself, again, was the cause of death, or whether, once again, it was the reactive oxygen species. So what they did was they added antioxidants and antioxidant enzymes to see what effect it would have and whether it would allow the animals to have a longer lifespan, including the lack of sleep. And they did that, and it worked. So these animals, they even sleep deprived, their physiological responses return to a healthy level. The gut returned to a healthy level. The cells in the gut are very good at regenerating, and so it was good. And then they did further experiments which showed that taking antioxidants in general won't just, magically improve your physiological state or your gut state. These antioxidants are very contextual, so they only act in the way that you need them to act if there is present reactive oxygen species, because what they do is they neutralize these valence electrons. And so just to point out that taking antioxidants for the sake of antioxidants won't improve your lifespan or anything like that. It's very contextual.
No. I was actually thinking that as I was doing this research. I was like, the key to life is just antioxidants.
No, they only work if you already have reactive oxygen
but do they
species.
They don't have negative effects if you don't.
No, they don't.
So,
but they just, it's like taking vitamins. Once you reach your limit, you can have more, but it's not going to do anything.
But definitely this is a key idea of sleep being antioxidant, and the bi-directional relationship with between sleep and these biochemical reactions, because sleep is antioxidant, but then I also read that oxidative stress is a trigger of sleep. So basically, the need to sleep is linked to the accumulation of this oxidative stress.
It makes sense. I think they did say that when the animals were really sleep deprived, they would sleep and then they would regenerate, and then they would have to sleep deprive them even more in order to build up that reactive oxygen species again.
Yeah.
You know what? Curiously enough, is a really good antioxidant.
Rooibos.
No. I didn't know that, but okay.
Sorry, that probably sounded so random, but we were just talking about rooibos tea, and it is apparently its main benefit is antioxidation.
That's nice.
But sorry, what were you gonna say?
So tying very nicely with the fact that sleep deprivation causes reactive oxygen species, a wonderful antidote is melatonin.
Oh.
Melatonin is known as an antioxidant.
Okay, that makes more sense.
But it's just such an incredible puzzle, how it just all fits together.
Yes.
Isn't it?
It just works so well.
It works so beautifully. And they show that when there's sleep deprivation, that over time there's less melatonin and therefore less antioxidants and consequently more reactive oxygen species.
Yeah. So, back to, again, sleep serving a primarily metabolic function. Yes, what I find interesting, of course, is the evolution of sleep across species. And firstly, if sleep is primarily metabolic, then where do we draw the line of plants undergo rhythms of metabolism, photosynthesis occurs during the day, takes a break at night, and also plants synthesize melatonin. So maybe this functions in the same way to alter oxidation.
Oh my god, maybe.
Yeah.
That'd be so interesting to look into.
Yeah, let's switch from being neuroscientists to studying plants.
Yes.
Plants have a brain.
We're halfway there. We're already so into fungi, so
that's true.
Just
and enzymes. But yeah, so where do we draw the line of what we consider as sleep, and also the fact that though now sleep has functions in the brain too, such as memory consolidation, if you haven't yet checked out that episode.
Yes.
These may have evolved as together with the evolution of a brain structure as part of the nervous system. And I was thinking that since the brain has additional functions of interoception and top-down control of some autonomic functions, which we
Yes.
also mentioned in the breathing episode.
Yes.
When you mentioned about dreaming being like top-down control, but also autonomic.
Yes.
And you mentioned dreaming being
like lucid dreaming.
Yeah, being like an autonomic function in a way.
Yeah.
But also controllable. So
Yes.
I was just thinking, do we as humans with the brain, do we have more top-down control of how our sleep can affect us?
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's like developing this new function for sleep.
Oh.
Yeah.
Do you mean as in terms of like whether or not we're in charge of our own sleep deprivation?
Yes, in terms of whether or not we control both our sleep rhythms, but also like how sleep affects our mental state, I guess.
Yeah. It's interesting, this balance between autonomic systems as well as our own volition and control over them.
And how this may have evolved
across
species. In a way, this is a great way to gain insights into like how new cognitive functions arose. Sleep being most probably originally metabolic and biochemical to turning into cognitive. Yeah.
Hope you've enjoyed listening to this podcast on sleep and that you'll have a very well-rested night tonight.
Yes.
And neutralize all of your reactive oxygen species that you've built up throughout the day.
Don't forget
metabolism and ATP synthesis.
Don't forget to drink your rooibos tea.
Yes.
I still struggle to pronounce it so much. And also take your melatonin.
And vitamins and any antioxidants.
Take care of yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hope you enjoyed listening to this episode.